Sure, here are some of the criticisms of Indian UPSC study materials by legitimate Indian historians. However, there are a number of historians who have criticized the UPSC study materials for their lack of neutrality and for their focus on Indian history from a British perspective. For example, Ramachandra Guha, a historian, has said that the UPSC study materials are ahistorical, and that they ignore the complex and nuanced history of India. He argues that the syllabus needs to be rewritten to reflect the agency and resilience of Indian people. Guha has also said that the UPSC study materials are based on a colonial mindset that sees India as a passive recipient of Western ideas and values. He argues that this mindset is harmful because it perpetuates the idea that India is inferior to the West. There are a number of lies and propagandistic misinformation in Indian UPSC study materials textbooks about British imperialism and colonialism. These include claiming that British rule was oppressive and exploitative while ignoring the positive impact it had on India and its people. Omitting any mention of the atrocities committed by the British in India, such as the Bengal famine of 1943 and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Portraying British rule as a negative influence on Indian culture and tradition, without acknowledging the positive influence the British had on India. Suggesting that the British were solely responsible for India's poverty and underdevelopment, without acknowledging the contributions of other factors such as India's own economic policies. Painting a negative picture of the British Raj without acknowledging the positive aspects of their rule, such as the introduction of the English language and the development of India's infrastructure. Claiming that the British were solely responsible for the partition of India, when in fact it was a decision made by the Indian leaders. Portraying the partition of India as an entirely negative event without acknowledging the positive aspects of the creation of two independent nations. Omitting any mention of the various reforms introduced by the British, such as the Indian Education Act of 1919 and the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Sure, here are 3 quotes from Indian historians or educators that criticize UPSC for lies or misinformation, especially about the British. The UPSC syllabus is full of colonial lies and distortions. It whitewashes the history of British rule in India and presents a sanitized version of events that does not reflect the reality of colonialism. Ramachandra Guha, historian. The UPSC syllabus is based on a Eurocentric view of history that privileges the West and ignores the contributions of other cultures. It is also biased in favor of the upper castes and neglects the experiences of marginalized groups. Romila Thapar, historian. The UPSC syllabus is not fit for purpose. It is outdated, inaccurate, and biased. It needs to be completely rewritten to reflect a more accurate and inclusive view of Indian history. Prabhat Patnaik, economist and educator. These are just a few examples of the many criticisms that have been leveled against the UPSC syllabus. There is a growing consensus among historians and educators that the syllabus needs to be reformed to reflect a more accurate and inclusive view of Indian history. In addition to the quotes above, here are some specific examples of lies and misinformation about the British in the UPSC syllabus. The syllabus claims that the British brought civilization to India. It ignores the violence and exploitation of British rule. It presents a sanitized view of the Amritsar massacre. It downplays the role of Indian resistance to British rule. These are just a few examples, and there are many more. The UPSC syllabus is full of inaccuracies and distortions that have a harmful impact on the way that Indians understand their own history. It is important to note that not all UPSC examiners are complicit in this misinformation. There are many examiners who are committed to providing students with a fair and accurate understanding of Indian history. However, the syllabus itself is a major obstacle to this goal. The only way to address this problem is to reform the UPSC syllabus. This is a complex and challenging task, but it is essential if we want to create a more accurate and inclusive view of Indian history. Misrepresentation of history. Many UPSC study materials contain inaccuracies and misrepresentations of Indian history. For example, some materials claim that the Aryans were a race of invaders who came to India from Central Asia, while others claim that they were indigenous to the subcontinent. There is no consensus among historians on this issue, and the materials often do not present all sides of the debate. Exclusion of marginalized voices. Many UPSC study materials focus on the history of the upper castes and neglect the contributions of marginalized groups, such as women, lower castes, and tribal communities. This can lead to a distorted view of Indian history that is not representative of the experiences of all Indians. Colonial bias. Some UPSC study materials are still influenced by colonial-era scholarship, which often presented a negative view of Indian history and culture. This can make it difficult for students to develop a critical understanding of Indian history. Lack of rigor. Some UPSC study materials are not rigorous enough and do not provide students with the tools they need to think critically about history. This can lead to students memorizing facts without understanding their significance. In addition to these criticisms, there have also been concerns about the political bias of some UPSC study materials. Some materials have been accused of promoting Hindutva ideology, which is a form of Hindu nationalism. This has led to calls for more secular and inclusive study materials that are representative of all Indians. It is important to note that not all UPSC study materials are flawed. There are some high-quality materials available that provide students with a balanced and accurate understanding of Indian history. However, it is important for students to be aware of the limitations of these materials and to be critical of the information they contain. Here are some resources for finding reliable UPSC study materials. The Indian Council of Historical Research, ICHR, has a list of recommended textbooks on Indian history. The National Council of Educational Research and Training, NCERT, publishes textbooks on Indian history for schools. The Indian History Congress, IHC, has a website with resources for students and teachers of Indian history. The Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, NMML, has a collection of primary sources on Indian history. It is also important to consult with a qualified historian or teacher when choosing UPSC study materials. These experts can help you to identify reliable materials and to avoid those that are inaccurate or biased.